wore a sombrero.
I feel it. I feel it.
And you know, we spoke at length a little bit earlier, but we've always been speaking at length for many years now about art and the culture we are a part of and seek to advance, both aesthetically and intellectually and theoretically. So we're going to get into all that today, and also cover you as an advocate, but also as a gallery director, which is another important conversation to be having. So what I'll do to start us off, I am going to read off your bio as I normally do. I just kind of switch it off just to have people have some context about you. POESIA is a world-renowned visual artist from San Francisco Bay Area, born in 1975, who began doing graffiti for 25 years, who has been doing graffiti for 25 years. During his early years as a graffiti writer at the turn of the 90s, he was recognized for his experimental wild style pieces. In the middle of the decade, he became involved with the Transcend Collective. During this period, artists became one of the pioneering practitioners of what became known as abstract graffiti, along with Joker, Kofi, and She One in the collective. Whether he is mirroring the work of old masters, composing collages, or creating gestural abstract paintings, POESIA's work consistently carries the same sense of immediacy as seen in the contemporary street art. He wields a hybrid style that is able to bridge the gallery and the street, as well as history with the contemporary. He is also the founder of the website graphfuturism.com that has led to the Graph Futurist movement, or group per se, and the site has become a podium to advocate progressive graffiti and unite a geographically disparate community of international artists and their audiences. Graph Futurism was founded in 2010 and has exhibited as a group in 5 major cities around the world, including Paris, Los Angeles, London, Glasgow, and Miami. That said,
a lot of words, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot of words. I've got to practice speaking in public. So, Art, you know, you and I are very cerebral when it comes to this culture and just the culture of art in general, right? But that's not really what we come from. We're not the typical pedigree that kind of defines this kind of academic space or this cultural space when we talk about art. You and I are writers, we're style writers, and we both come into it from very different angles, cities, and time periods. So what we're going to do, just to jump this off, is going to start with your story in it, right? Like, about how you, as a young kid, was brought into this culture through your relatives, right? You said your cousin introduced you.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm going to frame it for folks that you were coming from San Jose.
Yeah.
So perhaps you can tell us how this would come about for you, and what years are we talking about?
I think initially started writing like tagging, like 88 maybe. Just growing, you know, just a young teenager, 14, 13 maybe, and then, you know, kind of coming up, and then just learning, then seeing, you know, family members that were a little bit farther along, like kind of bus hopper graffiti taggers from South Bay, San Jose, and then just kind of looking at everything, and then, you know, that's kind of what was my introduction. But for me, I think I have a different personality type where it's like once I'm into something, I'm into it. So I think I just took it to a different level, where a lot of my family, they were just, you know, in it during the phase or whatever. It's like I took it from tagging to what you're looking at was 91. My first piece was actually in a bridge in Modesto. I was living up there for a couple of years. And that's kind of where it started, just taking the leap from a sketchbook, from, you know, being in a black book, and then, you know, taking it to a wall. And it was
Right.
like, once that happened, it was just, it was just like the bug, it's over.
Right. And did you feel that you were just kind of copycatting or just trying to find identity or define your youth through this?
Yeah, I think it was just, it's all of that. You know what I mean? It's just like growing. It's just like making your mark, like we all did when we started, and then just, just seeing something then. But what the real turning point is that when you don't see yourself as an artist, and then you're starting to paint, and then everyone asks you, and it's still to this day, I feel uncomfortable with the word artist when people ask me. I'm like, nah, I mean, I'm a painter maybe, but back then it's like you see that you can potentially be something that you never saw yourself as, and then recognizing that is like what kind of gives you that energy to keep like progressing and moving fast. And that's kind of what it was. It's just like once you start tagging, then you start drawing, and you start learning, and you start like experimenting, like you just, everything opens up to you, and you see yourself as a whole different person, kind of.
Right. And was there any kind of training when you were young in school or anything like that?
No, I'm not. Nah, I mean, I'm not a talented guy. No training. Just like I didn't, I never graduated, any classes in high school. Dropped out probably freshman year. Just involved in tagging and kid stuff, and but I had a family that supported me, right? And that I wasn't a bad kid, but I was just doing what I wanted to do at an early age, and I just wasn't. School wasn't for me in that way. It was just too easy for me to just, it was a waste of time kind of for me.
Mm-hmm.
I felt, even though it's not, nothing against school, but like I just didn't progress in that. I was so into the art part and graffiti that's what I wanted to do every day.
It's interesting. Let me interject for a second, because it's interesting that you say, and this is what the statement I'm going to make kind of runs through your story, that you would say that you're feeling that you weren't that talented and that you were just kind of relying on your instinct, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like I feel like that's, like there's, we all have stories of, friends that are, oh, this guy's the artist, this guy's he could draw, he can copy anything, Me, I wasn't that guy, but I had a heart, and I had the determination, and I think I had just like this instinct of like how to utilize my weaknesses and turn them into like strengths. And I think that's more that instinctual, kind of going, that's part of like my my art. And I think I embraced it early on because I knew I wasn't necessarily a good draftsman or something like that, and I had to utilize what I had, which was my mind, and whatever hand, whatever mark making that I had.
Right. But also, it would serve us to point out that your peers were the ones too encouraging you and helping you develop this skill set, right? Or this kind of way of expressing yourself. And you ended up being part of the Lord's crew, Legends of Rare Design, with several notable people, right?
Yeah, definitely. That started with the family thing, and then I kind of met everybody, and I just kind of really melded in. That was my core years of being a graffiti artist, was in that crew. I think I left, that was my traditional growth, and it was for that.
And I think it's important to kind of note on that, right? When we look at your first piece, how well defined and developed that is in the traditional vernacular of style writing, so to speak. In terms of the letter form, not the painting form. The painting form is just a whole nother thing, right? A whole nother direction. But when we look at this black and white, what we're seeing in terms of letter form is something in the sort of abstract or organic kind of formation. And this is your name. And this
it's my name, and and it was just like West Coast wild style, like Picasso, TWS, Lords, like all these influences that have coming from where you're from New York. It all comes from New York, but this was passed down through me through all these things, and there was no internet. I didn't even know where this came from. I just said it would just cross my path, and I took inspiration. You know what I mean?
And where else were you drawing influence? What else was informing you and those around you during this period?
This was just still the graffiti, right? It was still trying to capture this horizontal, intricate, skinny. Everyone, I don't know what even people call it, skinny bar, like wild style. This like West Coast. There was like a cross in the middle of this piece right here. I was, this cross was like kind of starting to, look at some traditional, Renaissance art. I was still studying, this was, I was about maybe 18, 19 when I did this piece. It was like 94, 95. And it was, pretty different from everybody else. But also at the same concurrently, I had got my GD and was going to class and learning art history. So I was like learning art but I was still from the school of graffiti. So I was still doing graffiti, but it hadn't influenced my graffiti yet. But I was soaking it in. Right. And I was like, multi things were happening to me, but I was keeping them separate at this time. And this was still graffiti.
Right. Let me pause on that thought for a second, because this is important to me. Especially, it was important to me too, as a young man. As you start studying art history, you're a writer, you're putting it out there on the street with your friends. And art history kind of has a way of informing us of where we are in the arc of humanity and or the artist's the artist's history, right? I know that I questioned a lot in contrast to the writers and the art history that I was learning, and saying, like, where are the parallels? Like, or where are we in that canon, and do we fit into that canon, and why not if we don't?
Yeah. I think what, for me, actually, we didn't talk about it earlier, but for this era right here, that piece actually that was there, and this was happening when, Barry McGee was actually, going, and he did the Yerba Buena Center Museum mural. And then this was like maybe a year or at the same year. I remember he came by the wall and gave, we talked, and he introduced me to his first show at SF MoMA. And when I seen that's looking at Barry's show, and at the same time of doing this graffiti piece, which is starting to actually expand and become more abstract, where I'm doing the backgrounds, doing graffiti on top, is because of like seeing this, what Barry was just, he was going to school for it, but seeing him in a museum, which is SF MoMA, where we just were at a wall together, and then just like I had no clue that you could even do that. Right. And so that opened my eye, and just like, what is this? Like, this whole art, there's a whole other side of art. And then he's doing graffiti in a museum, like, where, he's has drawings, his tags. It was kind of a surreal moment. You know what I mean?
So let me ask you something, because I'm having a memory recall right now, because was this the installation that he did, the big red one? I was there. With Joe's, and as a matter of fact, and we were there when I believe Jim Prigoff was giving the talk.
Yeah, everybody was there. And
and I believe it was a little contentious for us New Yorkers, actually.
Right? I mean, you're walking in an institution, right? Yeah. And it's totally different. I don't see how you guys saw it, but for me, it opened my eyes that, wow, like, I was already kind of learning art, but this was a whole different, like, you could actually, there was a transition here from painting on the street, which was that first graffiti, learning what I'm learning in school, and then seeing an artist go into a museum. And, it was a very, like, eye-opening moment for me.
Sure. And yeah, because again, placement is everything, but I think placement, when you think in terms, as you were saying about art history, that's just a whole nother complexity and train of thought in the work. And it's interesting because you had pointed out to me about this piece, some very interesting things in terms of kind of breaking away from a traditional format in graffiti, and that you were concerned with, and I'll zoom in the detail, with kind of a texture, a fabric
Yeah,
texture in the
yeah,
in the piece, but it's more importantly what you were referencing.
yeah.
So
It was,
tell me about this.
so basically, like, this was just one of those things where it's like I was constantly at at my house drawing, or like copying old master paintings, and a lot of the old master, or even, draftsmen would just do drapery studies, like drawings, like a study of a drawing and of drapery, and then, or they would do statues, and the drapery was so ornate, but it flowed like it flowed really well. And I reference it to graffiti because of how this movement that you're always trying to capture, and this flow that you're trying to get. So I started to cross over in this piece, and I started to like bring some of the drapery. I wasn't really good at it with the spray can because this was just like literally off the top of my head, trying to, oh, let me try to work some drapery in here. And like you could see some of the parts where you see this, rendered drapery happening, but I was trying to relate the flow of the old master drawings, and then the flow of wild style my graffiti, and then also this futuristic, like linear stuff. And I was kind of starting to push on some electronic kind of stuff. So this was just like a mismatch of all these things in my head, and I was just trying to work them out. You know what I mean?
And again, you had mentioned to me about kind of the when you do something like that, that's kind of a little bit off the beaten path, so to speak,
Yeah.
that people won't fully grasp, you return back to a format that the community could grasp.
Yeah, this was like Oakland Yards, and a very important Coliseum Yard spot that's like, Legends, Dream, everybody, Poem, TDK. So it's like here, I've experimented, before in this yard when I was younger, but I was just like, a lot of the kids didn't know who I was, what I was doing, and it wouldn't last. So, this time I came to the yard, I was like, I'm just going to do a more traditional piece to honor, Oakland in this yard, but also just to make sure it runs, you know what I mean? So, and just to kind of like, let me do some traditional stuff with a 3D,
Yeah.
with a fill-in. Just let me just try that instead of always going over the edge and experimenting, like, and then these pieces are kind of that. They're more just to kind of like, hey, you know, you see my abstract stuff, but I could still do this other stuff, you know what I mean? And I like doing it too, but it's a moment. It's like there's a time and place for everything kind of thing, you know what I mean?
Right, right. And I like this piece for a lot of the things that um, you know, that are happening in it in terms of scale, composition, the weight of your
Yeah,
letters or the flow, everything about it, it seems to work in that space and in that scale.
yeah,
And again, it's this one it's almost like a big swooping arc that keeps looping, and your arm, I could only imagine
yeah,
all the physicality of this piece.
yeah. And this was what was fun about it, right? And it was kind of like these merging of old stuff, drawings and sketches that, there's one thing that I lost probably in 2000. I lost pretty much my whole archive for the first 15 years of my graffiti. So I lost all my black books. So like this was kind of
Wow.
trying to recreate some of that stuff. And
Yeah,
like
this
this
one
is,
is interesting for me because again, when you start again leaving it open-ended, right? The
yeah, yeah.
lines, the suggestions, the gestures. What's bringing you here? Why break away from the traditional format?
Because this whole thing, this concept was about like, one, if you've seen the whole wall, it was like the first thing I did. I was like, I had this aesthetic in my head of like, I want to create this like massive painting, like a bat, like what I would consider like a nice painting with sepia colors and abstract. So we painted all these crazy flare tags and like washes of all this bucket paint that we got, from Home Depot, the cheap shit. And we mashed this whole painting together. Then that we use that as a backdrop. But that kind of, we had to collaborate too, because when you have to collaborate with Rome's next to me. I think this other guy Mess was the top natural. So what this piece was kind of like seeing some of their break off, but also they had pieces that were more structured. So I always like to play with like messing kind of with what you think is like, okay, here's a 3D, but then it's not a 3D. It's actually just one line. Like I was always trying to like mix, or here's a disappearing 3D that doesn't, it just goes into nowhere or turns into a cloud. I was always trying to play with like this mismatching of like tradition and like new abstract. And this was kind of like one of those pieces that was kind of doing that.
Right. And again, I'm going to point this out to everybody. What year was this, by the way?
This was, I think, 2004, somewhere around there.
Okay. Because this kind of concept, these gestures, return back at a later date. So it's interesting to see it from this vantage, right? From the genesis to where you arrive. And again, you know, that's I like the experimentation you've been going through, particularly with painting. And when we look at this, you know, there's some, again, breaking the format, leaving an open format, but there's this points to particular things that we mentioned, Futura, of course, and the Chrome Angels, and this was painted in Paris.
Yeah, this is Paris 2012 or 11.
Right. And so when you go to Paris, what were your expectations of being a graffiti writer in Paris, or being quote unquote artist, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, to me, Paris has always been like I felt like my second home. Like, not just because you know, I've been there, but because what I saw there, the experimentation and the freedom, and what I learned from a lot of guys like So What and a lot of the, you know, Lek, just talking to them, is that, you know, they're very, even when you go there, they're protesting, they're very like, you know, I don't know what, the progressive, you know what I mean? And I think that in the graffiti, in their tag, like when I do a tag, they're like, oh, that's a traditional tag. Like, but you look at Tomek or Seo or Jorge, like the PAL guys, their tags are just like, you know, they're very abstract tags, you know, but,
right.
you know, so for me, I've always seen a lot of progression in Paris. And then when I went there, like, I thought I was progressive, and then seeing what they're doing was like, wow, you know, I'm kind of like, you know, I'm like normal, you know what I mean? Like, these guys are really breaking from tradition.
Weren't you considering the things we were doing in New York at that time? Because we were way ahead of the curve.
Oh, yeah. Like, I think, but the problem with New York is that there's such, you know, a fundamental, like, thing about tradition, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, when you think about New York, you think tradition and the Mecca and that, and then people hold on to that. And then you go to other places, and even though, yeah, you guys were way ahead even in 85, but we didn't see none of that, right? It like was past us. What you guys did.
There was no internet.
Yeah, there was no internet. So like, we didn't even see that you guys were already doing all this stuff, like, you know, 15 years, 20 years, like way before we even started even writing, maybe. You know what I mean? Like, I think you were doing stuff before I even started writing. So it's like, it was so, it was almost like, you know, unless you just knew, and you knew somebody that had all these archives, it wasn't like common knowledge, you know what I mean? And that's the tough part.
Right, which speaks to what you were saying earlier about instinct, right? About trying to find your way.
Yeah.
And again, you know, and you mentioned abstraction, because if we look closer, and I always point this out to people when they talk about graffiti in kind of very generalized way, and I get more technical and academic about it, because if you kind of pull focus from the letter form, or perhaps, you know, go macro, right? You start seeing really genuine abstraction, well thought out abstraction, you know, and so in the defense of graffiti, I've always kind of like went in closer to find what the future might be for it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I live in the details. Like, I think that I get lost in the details sometimes too much. You know what I mean?
So given that you're a guy who's looking to break the format, you arrive here at a painting like this. Yeah. Tell me about this.
So this was, you know, like a point, I think late 90s, maybe not late, but like 97, 98. I don't know. It was a time where I was like experimenting really tough with abstraction. I had already started to transition and cross over my studio practice. I wasn't even studio practice, but just, you know, art, painting, and into graffiti. And then this piece was kind of like me being in the yard and letting go, right? And being like, hey, look, let me do it. This is, says POE. It was a Poe piece for, you know, part of my name. But it was just like, you know, I got some chrome ink, Rust-Oleum ink. I had made my own ink with it, with, you know, mixing it. And I just wanted to use just some simple, you know, I was influenced a lot by like Chinese calligraphy a lot. So this red, black, and white was really big in a lot of my paintings in the studio. And then, you know, a lot of that comes from also Barry used a lot of that. So that was an influence, but a lot of it was more traditional, these just monochromatic. And then I just went and kind of freestyled this piece, but it was for me a breakthrough for me because it was just letting go of the tradition, but keeping some of the flow and keeping the points that I wanted to keep from it, but also trying to expand and progress. For me,
Right.
everything's about progression, you know?
And given that progression sometimes is deviation, what were your peers or those in proximity to you saying about this process?
I think they thought I was crazy, for real. Like, I was painting in yards, these pieces, right? Like this piece, this was a Coors Yard in San Francisco. And I've had people that were traditional painting, like, what the hell? Like, they didn't know what it was. Like, this is like some calligraphy freestyle. Like, I was doing like, you know, like it says my name, but it was just so fluid. And like, I was just trying to like, just go for it. I was using bucket paint too as background. I was trying to paint, like I was trying to create paintings that were graffiti pieces still. I still was stuck to the graffiti piece and the format, but I was trying to integrate painting. And when I did these in yards, I was going over like really good traditional burners, but you know, I felt that it was something that needed to happen. And they didn't last that long all the time, but I think people thought I was pretty, like, they didn't know what to think of it. I don't even know how this was one. Like, this was my name, but I painted it like backwards. Like, the S was first, and there's an I over it, and then the O was in the middle, and the P was on the end. And it was just like, this was when Transcend was happening, and I was just like, I had found some peers. I had,
Right.
like, got the green light, and then there was, like, a traditional E in the bottom, another one. And I was just like, I'm just going to go for it. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but if I don't do this, like, why am I painting?
Right.
If I'm, you know what I mean? Like, if I just can't go do this on a wall in a yard, you know, I don't know, like what's just quit or just stay in the studio. I still was stuck to the wall, you know?
Right. Let's talk about the Transcend group, because you bunch of, you know, kind of like, kind of graffiti rogue misfits, breaking tradition.
Yeah, this Kema.
And Kema. Tell me about those kind of conversations that you had about where you saw lettering, not just lettering, but the culture.
This was like, I think, like starting the like 96 to 97. Joker called me because one of the pieces I did, and you know, he had a mutual friend, Ray, which was Raven, and he was just like, hey man, like, I think you should get down with Transcend. Like, we're a collective. Like, this is Joker, and it's not about graffiti. It's like about art. I didn't even know what he was really talking about, but I love Joker stuff. I respected him, and I was like, yeah, I'm down. Like, and then he introduced me to, you know, She Won's work here, and you know, Kema was a more traditional graffiti artist, but was like really starting to like be like, I almost call it like really smart graffiti. Like, I'm talking, these guys were the most traditionally balanced. They have every aspect of the you know, the tag to the straight. They could do it all, but they started just really slanting it and going in a cool abstract direction, you know, and I was digging it. And then we just started vibing off each other. Like, Joker was going crazy. There's Coffee got down. Derek Bruno recently got down. Mr. Jago. Like, we have a lot of guys that are just like intellectual stylists in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? We're just like taking graffiti roots and just kind of like going crazy and not having any, just pushing the envelope a lot. You know what I mean? I was really attracted to that, and I was really, you know, still to this day, you know, that's important to me.
Right. And when the interesting thing, right, once you start breaking off, breaking away into this space, into contemporary works, not just your work changes, but your thinking and the way you speak about work starts to shift, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you start thinking about some of these things in your paper drawings, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
in
this was
this
an early
period,
sketch. Yeah, this was an early sketch that, you know, of all the stuff I lost, this is, you know, one of the only drawings I have from this era. This was like 95, maybe 96. And it's a RAE piece for Ray, which was, I was working with Raven a lot. He was helping me kind of like expand a little bit of the style wise, just kind of like just really going deep on it. And it was really abstract though, and I don't even, you know, but I didn't notice this when I looked at it later, like how it's still always going to be influencing the future of what I'm doing, you know.
sure.
But this was really, progressive back then in the 90s. And yeah, this piece too was like, you know, doing a watercolor, you know, working with and outlining it and finding letter forms and stuff that you see a lot nowadays, you know, because everything's on the table. But back then it was, you know, it was far in between that you seen something that just was different. And this was in the early 90s too. And these ones kind of set the tone for me for a long time. And this was more moving into like a more refined me, you know, like a mixture of like tagging and piecing and like having this really organic flow with pins, influenced by like architecture, Zaha Hadid, still having traditional 3D elements, but you can't see them, but also abstract. It was just, you know, me just kind of like really not being able to paint, but being able to try to capture what I wanted to capture as far as making sure I got these ideas on paper, even though if I wasn't painting them or on a wall, you know. And that's kind of what the
Right. And
sketching is to
what
me
I
as well.
find interesting about it, and you know, infamously in Style Wars, Scheme's mom was on his case for doodling and scribbling.
Yeah.
But there's purpose in that, right? And
Oh
and
yeah, of
and
course.
and in particular, when you think about these, and like you said, how these will inform you later, that
Yeah.
comes to mind. And you mentioned Zaha and architecture, and she was a big fan of the Russian constructivists and the modern
Yeah.
art movement. And you start venturing into that space with hardline geometry.
Yeah. And then this was like one of those cases. Like this drawing is like, it was something that burns in your mind too when you're young. Like, you know, Marcel Duchamp, Nude Descending the Staircase. You know, just this geometric cubist futurist movement, but then also having an abstract, but that disappeared. And then when I came back to, you know, rehashing things and I wanted to work with letters, this is a piece that says my name. But what I wanted to do, I think I did it for a whole year. Like I just put myself on a training. I said I want to just do all geometric, not even just all straight pieces, meaning that no lines, I mean no curves. So I wanted to try to capture the same kind of movement and flow uh, that I have with using curves, but just with straight lines. And I did it for a year. It was like an exercise for me. And then I did a whole year of doing only gesture, no straight lines. And these were just things and exercises like you do if you take a figure drawing class and you do a linear drawing, or you do um, a straight drawing with lines, and you create,
Yeah.
you know, you're just exercising these things. But this was all for me to learn something or break something that I had, like, you know, your hand is a certain way. You almost have to like break your hand to be able
Well,
to
it's
do
also
something different, you
again,
know?
it's also in a way breaking history and remixing it. You know, I
Yeah,
mean, one of the things I think we share is this dialogue with history, right? And how to
yeah,
remix it through the eyes of our culture, our generation. And you know, like you said, this says your name, but it's pointing to
yeah,
futurists. But then what's interesting is that you go on and do these ab-X paintings, right? These
yeah,
exercises, gestural and whatnot.
yeah. And then this was the other side of me that was like my instincts, you know what I mean? It was like this, you know, this was my hand. Like I couldn't get rid of this, you know what I mean?
Right.
So,
And again, this is all leading, and my apologies, folks, because of the bright white and the fine line. But
yeah,
what's important about this, of course, it's the line work. But more importantly, if we look a little closer, it's dated and it says graffiti futurism, right?
Yep.
And this segues into something really important about your thinking and your work, right?
Yeah.
Because you're already breaking out in your practice, but cerebrally you are thinking a bit broader about the art, right?
Yeah.
And what it means to move into this contemporary space. And you start the website Graph Futurism.
Yeah.
Now, when I discovered Graph Futurism, I was like, oh, great, finally, some, kindred soul. He gets it.
Yeah.
And so tell me about the genesis of Graph Futurism and why you felt this was going to be as important and essential as it is.
Yeah, I think like that sketch kind of like happened in a time where I had come back. You like all know, like we all come back from life. So I came back from a stint of not painting. Came back 2008, started painting again. 2010, or I got online and I was like, let me research what's going on, because in the 90s I was so experimental, but nobody was like that. I came back in 2010, Coffee, amazing artists, Remy Ruff, Jabo. These guys were doing some stuff that was like, I wish these guys were around back when I was like young, but they were there now though. So what I did was I tried to bring people together, and I didn't see a space for us, right, online. I didn't see I seen all these, blogs and Juxtapose and Arrested Motion and street art, here, street art, whatever, street art news, everything was street art, There was no graffiti. And if it was graffiti. There was no place for me, right? And I think the biggest thing when I travel the world and meet artists is that exactly what you said. Every artist tells me, I found a place that I could feel I could feel like I could be myself. Like I felt like connected to you guys in this way. And it just happened naturally, organically. And I just created the site because I felt like nobody else was going to show the work that I was seeing out there. I wasn't making the work. I didn't create it. I didn't create the movement. But I was the one to bring it together, and kind of we all connected together. And we all,
Right.
yeah.
And I remember when we first talked about this, it was interesting because I kind of pressed you to really choose your words carefully and define the connection between futurism, right?
Yeah.
Because traditional futurism is one thing and graffiti is one thing, and you made a compelling argument for it, and certain parallels, but again, you were pushing to I think not just point to futurism per se, but aiming towards the future.
Yeah, the future. And that's where it was, where it's like, it was really a bad term when because of futurism. But like that term's still relevant. I feel like it's still relating to something beyond today, which is, that's where I felt, I thought you were there in '85, you know what I mean? When you made your first graffiti sculpture,
my first one was you'll appreciate this. Sorry, Art. My first graffiti sculpture was in 1984, and
84,
but it was a Dada sculpture.
That's what I'm saying.
I will soon reveal that someday. It's a very powerful piece. But again, that's where that conversation really started for me in terms of the sculpture part of my life.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. And those things were happening before. A lot of people don't realize is that, like, I wasn't trying to invent anything or like create something. I was just trying to like kind of collect all the ideas that maybe got passed over, and all the artists that kind of got passed over, and that maybe they didn't have the time to like send emails to blogs and show their work, or like what those Barnstormers, West, all these guys did was way previous to this, but it was in line with the same concept of progressive, coming from where we come from, the graffiti school or wherever you want to call it, and then just progressing it and not letting it dormant. And that's what I was trying to do,
Yeah, and what's fascinating as you look at some of these images and some of these works, they're clear examples of contemporary work, but really contemporary work that comes from the graffiti culture, right? The writers culture. And and that it's very diverse, and some of it is quite innovative in a way, but it also again pays homage to several histories, so to speak.
Yeah.
And to me, you know, art, you know, I've always defended this and this movement that like me is in dialogue with the history and also referencing it, that we're just inheriting something and advancing on those ideas for our time.
Yeah.
And so graph futurism is filling a void, and this type of work in our world it's really been bubbling for years. And I think, and I would debate, and I'll defend it, because it's equally as important as some of the work, you know, that generational artists have created, whether they were the Cubists or the Futurists or the Expressionists, etc. There's a lot to debate in that, that's legitimate. And
Exactly.
so,
And then, you know, like for me, it was just like, there was so much, right? A lot of people give me slack for it, but there was so much to document, and there was so many different styles that it was hard to, like, you know, you were asking me earlier, it's like, you know, what, you know, that it was able to happen. And it's like, yeah, L'avenir is like, you know, literally translated to the future in French. But there's essays that I had the energy, I don't know how I did it, but I had the energy to sit down and work with people like EKG, or, you know, these other academics, and try to figure this thing out. You know, how do we say, you know, where our place is in this thing, and also how do we bring relevance to ourselves when everybody else is writing us out of history, or already written the chapter that they think that we stand for. And I was really adamant about not letting it go and being an advocate for graffiti artists, right? And a lot of people, it's almost like what's happening now, where it's like everyone's pushing for socially responsible art or this stuff. They're pushing for what their connection is, right? This was my connection. This was my connection to art, was graffiti. And I didn't want to let that be, you know, taken over by somebody else, you know?
right. And again, it takes a lot of energy to do this. And so this obviously pulls you away from your work somewhat.
Yeah.
But you still, again, one of the things that impressed me was that while you were undertaking this in the studio, you were like really reaching back and really profoundly just in remixing history in a way that was so unexpected, looking at you know, classical paintings and modernism and graffiti, so to speak, in
Yeah.
these works.
Yeah, so exactly. And this is those things, you know, it's like we're coming back. I was doing this stuff when I was young, but I didn't really document it as much, right? But this, when I came back, it started in the studio. I was like, I was always drawn to Renaissance art history because of a teacher I had in junior college, where I took a couple classes and learned a lot. But I was always in love with the flow of it, you know, like the drapery, like this is some of that drapery that was in that piece in the 90s, you know what I mean? It was just like, wow, this is style. And then the composition of the figures in and out of each other, where they position them, the same thing we do with letters. And so for me, this was my chance to kind of like get people's attention with figures, you know, because people, it's always attention when you put a figure or a face, right? And I was trying to like utilize that to bring attention, to transition to what would be the next step, would be the actual get rid of the figures, and the composition and the flow is still there from a letter. And that's what this work was about.
When I saw these works, it struck me in a way that, you know, and I shared this with you about, and I shared the book, Working Space of Frank
Yeah, I still
Stella,
have it.
right?
I read it.
And at first, I remember when it was first published and I read it, it was so academically over my head, but I understood this kind of exactly what you're saying, and that's the way I just kind of related to art, so to speak, in terms of how do we break these things down in our language, so to speak, perhaps, or how do we remix it in our head?
Yeah.
And I think this really speaks to what he was kind of exploring for painting and sculpture at the same time.
Yeah.
Again, this was so unlike anything I had seen uh, in terms of modern graffiti. Though I'll point out that there was an artist that I went to school with who was a phenomenally gifted kind of traditional Renaissance style painter. He wrote
Yeah.
Conan. Are
Oh,
you
word.
familiar with him?
No.
Conan. He used to write with King One, but he wasn't exploring it in the way that you're doing it. But that you know, again, and I say this so that people can appreciate your thinking and your process that was much broader than the act of quote unquote vandalism.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, I wish I would have grown up in a different era or whatever. But what happens is that, like, we don't get a chance to, and you just take with what you have. And this is what I had, and this was my experience. And you know, these pieces, these are postcards that I painted on top of with spray paint and stuff. But you know, I didn't render any of these. These are just like color plates that I wanted to remix and collage. And this was, to me, you know, important parts of, like, bringing attention to graffiti in a way. You know, I mean, it's like I got to capture your attention somehow, but I want to show you how beautiful it is too. You know, and a lot of this stuff right here, this was done in the early work was done, I think, 2010. Influenced, like, I'd say, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say too many, but there was a lot of fine artists in the urban art, you know, vernacular, whatever you want to, whatever that word is, but the urban art genre,
Yeah.
the street art genre, that were following Graffuturism, that still tell me that everything that we did influenced, like, a lot of their work for like 5 years to come.
Yeah.
So
Let's just say I can say this with confidence that you can just look at, you know, at my backyard here at the Museum of Graffiti, one of the murals that we have in the back with Bacon and, excuse me, and I'm having like a moment, an aging moment here. And
I know which one you're talking about, though.
and yeah, I mean, they're going to kill me for spacing out on this. But again, he's drawing from that space, right?
Yeah.
Of how do you bring in style writing and, you know,
The figure.
not just the figure, the draping, you know, the Renaissance style
Yeah.
painting style. And so it does have a lasting effect. It really has. I saw it there.
Yeah. It was a good and it was a bad thing, right? Where it's like, there's one thing, you know, that you've heard it before when you talk about Graffuturism, is that, like, really, the people didn't know me, thought it was a style, right? And it was like, oh, this is a Graffuturist style, or artists would want to copy the style. A lot of Russian artists that, you know, that are amazing painters, like, took the style and made it their own, right? There's a lot of, like, artists that were not even close to where we're from, we never had any connection to, did amazing work, but now they've transitioned it, right? But
yeah,
a lot of people just took it and just was like, oh, this is Graffuturist style, which is when a lot of the guys that were involved in the beginning were like, I don't know if that's when you start having issues, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I try to leave Graffuturism open-ended. I just want to bring people together and minds together, but I didn't want to define anybody or all of us, right?
Right.
I wanted to leave it open-ended, and I wanted everyone to have their own say, because they do. And there is no style, if people want to ask. There is no Graffuturism style, right?
No, I'm glad you say that. And forgive me, I just want to give a shout out to Hyro and Quake, who were also part of the wall with Bacon that I was referencing. But yeah, I appreciate that. Again, you keep looking towards the past, right? And we see it in this composition here, your collage composition.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite collages I think I've ever done. I'm glad somebody didn't buy this. You know what I mean? It was for sale in a show, and it's like, I would have hated to give up. I would hate not to have it myself right now. It's like, to me, something that happens where you're and this is another word that a lot of people are using now that we started talking about, and I'll give it to Penner from Poland, and now all the Polish artists are amazing. Robert Prock, R.I.P., amazing painters from Poland that were part of the Graffuturists in the beginning. and they really, started deconstructing, right? And I went deep into a lot of writing, and I did and this is kind of like that. It's like you're taking something, you're deconstructing it, putting it back together in a new way. And, and it goes even farther with Yaki Starita. And I can't even read his stuff. It's too above my head. But I recognize that dialects and like these things are different to everybody when you look at them. And visually, it's the same way. And that's what this piece is kind of about, is that deconstruction. Mixing this figure and a supremacist painting together and making one painting,
One of the things that I've always kind of appreciated about the Europeans, especially when they got into graffiti, they had, more access to this rich history of modern art, so to speak.
They lived with it.
They lived with it, and art generally in the culture is well respected.
Oh yeah.
And by the time I got out there in '85, it was like a whole nother world to be embraced for what was vandalism here, right?
Yeah.
But that again, it's a culture issue, right? And how we're raised here as Americans, and particularly in Black and Latino families that don't have the kind of legacy or pedigree that's associated with art and art history, so to speak.
Oh, all day.
There's a disconnect in our story in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a lot of people like get on me about, not having people of color, or like, are being socially responsible. But like, I'm Latino, I'm Mexican, but I don't see myself as that when it comes to art, because I don't have that connection to that cultural Chicano art or Mexican art. I am that, but it's not. I learned through graffiti. My introduction was from graffiti, so I represent who I am as a graffiti, and that's what I want to paint about.
Right, but you transcend that, and as we're surveying your art, I mean, it's going again. You are bouncing back and forth from the timeline of art history.
Yeah.
You arrive here, which I think is kind of a good interpretation of the line drawings, the openness of painting, the fluidity of painting, and dare I say, closer to some things that I've seen from well-established and coveted American painters of the AbX movement.
Yeah, I mean, you could even say Kandinsky, like the spiritual, right? And this piece has also a contemporary part that you can't see, right? This drawing was done on a piece of drywall, and I really wanted to try to capture that this is a wall. You know what I mean? Like, this is a piece of a wall that just got taken out and painted on, so it has that material essence too, and that's what us evolving and pushing, more than just the aesthetic or the draftsman part. It's more like there's a well-rounded. I'm growing as an artist.
Right, and it's interesting because you're heavily invested in the painting, and some people who are looking at this may think, oh wow, that's a nice canvas, but again, this is again part of the if the word is correct, the ephemerality of writing and street art, right? Gone by now, and the photo is all we have to represent it.
Exactly. Like, you can see on the bottom, there's like cracked drywall, like hole.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's like, it's this, to me, like, I think there's a couple artists that are doing it really well now, but that they're doing this really, they're actually taking pieces of wall from certain places and doing stuff, which is cool. It's like there's deeper. I mean, we can go forever on that stuff, but for me, this is something that, it was just a natural thing for me. It wasn't too thought out. It wasn't too, I didn't try to make a whole thing about it, essay about it, but it was something that meant something to me. I mean, I think that's the best art, is that you're trying to just go with the flow. You understand it, you do it, but you don't need an essay to really, you still like the image no matter what, you know what I mean?
Got you. So Art, as we approach the hour, we're going to take a pause for the cause so I can save the video.
Yeah.
And so those joining us, hang tight. This is going to get really fantastic now as the second part, which I've been looking forward to, as if the first part wasn't good enough. So I'm going to save the video, stay on board, and I'll be right back.
All right.
Okay.